There is something really amazing about injecting a slime mold with nanoparticles that are conductive so that it can draw its own network and we can build an actual computer chip that actually conducts electricity. It's very tempting to imagine a future in which we have these wet computer systems that are kind of functionalized living organisms.
Hello and welcome to the Culture and Technology podcast, brought to you by the Vienna Business Agency. My name is Severin, and today's guest is Claire L. Evans. Claire is a writer and researcher based in Los Angeles. We've known each other for quite a while, and I got intrigued to talk to her on this podcast because of her current writing and research on the intersection of technology and biology. I believe some of these questions that she raises touch on some of the most urgent questions we should be asking ourselves today, such as, what actually is computing? How do computers shape our worldview and our relationship to nature? And what can we learn from mushrooms that have been solving problems for millions of years before humans even existed? I caught up with Claire over a Zoom call to find out what she found out. Welcome to the podcast, Claire.
Thank you so much for having me.
Last time we spoke, you just released Broadband, the book about the forgotten inventors of the internet, female inventors of the internet, back in 2018. And in 2021, you started your new newsletter, Wild Information, where you shared your research on computing and biology. So I wanted to know, how did that transition go from the last book, the last research, to the new research? What happened?
Writing Broadband was a process that took 3-ish years, and something you don't really anticipate when you're writing a book, or at least when you're coming up with an idea for a book, is how much of your life it's going to absorb and how much time you're going to spend in a certain kind of space. So I spent several years in this sort of deep research, archival, vintage computing mind space, which was really fun and compelling. Very lonely, though, because I was just in my room with PDFs and talking to people on the phone, occasionally visiting archives and libraries and talking to people, but mostly quite by myself. And then when the book came out, I spent almost 2 years on the road promoting it, giving talks, going to conferences, going and speaking at tech companies. And I found myself in this world of essentially like well-meaning Silicon Valley adjacent thought leadership, people wanting to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion in tech, which is a super important subject, obviously. But it began to feel kind of like a treadmill. I was telling all these stories about these brilliant women that had been forgotten and ignored, and it didn't seem to me like anything was going to change or anything was really changing beyond a willingness to acknowledge the past, but not necessarily wanting to connect it to the present or the future. So, I don't know, I really began to think about where I wanted to be just in my mind and what kind of people I wanted to be around and what kind of conversations I wanted to be having for the years to come. You know, it's kind of selfish maybe to think of a book that way as just an environment you create for yourself, but that's essentially what it was. And I don't know, I became more and more drawn, and I think this is also a consequence of the pandemic, away from the computer and towards the world. I was doing a lot of gardening. I was doing a lot of walking, bird watching, all the stuff that everyone was doing during that time. And I became more and more interested in biology, realized how little I knew about it, how little I understood about it, and everything I read was compelling. And I realized that there was a space to be someone who was interested in biology, who was also a tech writer, that there was this convergence between biology as a discipline and computation, computer science, that there were people that were inhabiting this in-between space and were doing interesting stuff that I, as a tech writer, could engage with. I don't know, I got the idea of sort of writing like nature books about technology became really compelling to me. So that's where I've been. Of course, I don't have a background in biology. I had to teach myself a lot of things, and I'm still regularly Googling things I won't even admit on this podcast, like what is a molecule? Because it's not my field. So I'm coming in as a complete outsider, and learning as I go. And I've sort of been treating, I guess, my Substack and my freelance journalism career as, an opportunity to teach myself things. So every article that I write is like me learning about this subject as deeply and quickly as I can. And then I keep sort of daisy chaining these different subjects and articles and, pieces of writing together and the hopes that it will aggregate into something bigger, a larger narrative, a through line that's more than just my own interest. I think it's beginning to emerge. I don't want to say, I mean, I'm always quite hesitant, and this is something I thought about a lot with broadband. Like, there is no one narrative about anything, And I think maybe my strength as a writer, but also perhaps my weakness is that I'm too keen to engage like all these multiple different contradictory viewpoints. And, it's difficult to coalesce all those things into this is the story of this, which is what publishers want. So I'm still making a shape for what the book will be. For now, I'm just exploring the wild world of slime molds and mushrooms and brain cells.
Yeah, I would love to talk about some of these examples specifically.
Yeah.
I've written down in my preparation of this conversation slime molds and colonies, the Wood Wide Web, which are all articles you've written about in the last few years. But going back to the point of departure where you said, you wanted to surround yourself with different people in a very selfish way, but also felt maybe a little bit tired of the dominant narrative in tech, which is, I don't know, very progress-driven, hype-driven, very monocultural in a way, which I feel as well. And that's, I think, what definitely drew me to your writing over the last few years, where I felt like this is truly a new perspective and it might still be shaping up, but you can see it's different and it opens up new terrains of thought almost. So did you start this project specifically because you felt like maybe as a tech writer or as someone, you mentioned in one interview, a computer kid yourself that's still very much, interested in computers per se, but that you felt tired of these narratives that are mostly out there of how we work with tech, how we describe tech, how we write and think about tech?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've nailed it. It is a monoculture, and it's difficult to be a critic or a writer in the tech space because you're either sort of for or against it, It's like you're either a booster or you're a critic, and there's not a lot of ambiguity or gray area or space for exploration for, like you said, different terrains of thought, different modalities. Tech is also very extractive, ecologically. You look at things like data centers for training or AI models, data centers, and even just fundamentally like the silicon that we use to build computer chips, the rare earth minerals, the metals and rocks that go into building these systems. It's all very extractive. It's all very polluted. So there's also that element of it as well that just feels a bit overwhelming, that whatever small progress we make towards, renewables is immediately counteracted by the enormous amount of energy that your average, server farm takes up. So there's that. I forgot the question.
Well, if the existing narratives are kind of like boring.
Yeah, they are. Of course they're boring. And we all feel very locked in. I think one thing that really opened my mind is realizing that sort of computer architectures as we understand them, like the data processing machines that came into being in the mid-century, and that we've sort of, although we've built more and more sophisticated versions of those, they're all still based on fundamentally the same architecture, the sort of von Neumann computing architecture. That's just one way, that's just one way of building a computer. That's just the one that won out. But, there were analog computing systems before that. There's quantum computers coming up in the future. There are other models for just fundamentally like how we organize like the information architecture of computer systems. And then if you're willing to like sort of absorb that, then there are also different substrates. Silicon just happened to be the material that was the most convenient and cost efficient at the time. And we've been locked into this idea of, Moore's law, like we're just going to keep making smaller and faster chips with fundamentally the same material substrates until we kind of hit the hard edge of physics and enter into the world of like atomic scales. But there could be other substrates, like who's to say that future computing substrates couldn't be biotechnological in nature. There's a lot of work being done now in DNA data storage. It's all quite new, but it's also extremely ancient. And we're only beginning to kind of orient ourselves towards the possibilities there, which are, really profound. It's not just like that it's far out and interesting. It's more efficient. It's faster. It works better. We just need to sort of organize ourselves towards researching more in that space and developing things.
And is the perspective that is forming on your end a perspective that is, let us learn from nature in a better way so we can replicate it, or rather than dominate nature, which I think has been the predominant narrative in Western society for at least the last few hundred years? So is that also kind of like a sort of humility towards the earth, nature in a way that is also, very much, I think, necessary probably for surviving in the future.
Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of hubris, It's funny, like throughout history, we tend to compare like the human brain to different kinds of machines. We're always like, oh, the human brain is like, in the Victorian time, they would say that the human brain is like a steam engine and, or like a clockwork or something. We have this tendency to compare natural biological complexity and intelligence to mechanical systems as a way of understanding them. Now we say a brain is like a computer, and we even build artificial neural networks, which are fundamentally inspired by, the synaptic connections of the human brain to create, computer systems. But I think that's very telling, I think, of our weird human narcissism and hubris, that we're always trying to compare something which is enormously complex to something which is much less complex, but it is of our own construction. You know what I mean? Like, there's a computer, even the most powerful computer in the world, it still can't do things that the human brain can do. There are incredibly simple organisms like the slime molds, which I'm sure we'll talk about, that can do things that it takes an enormous amount of computational energy and time to do. So I don't know, I think the more that we learn about how living systems actually operate, and we can use a sort of computational framework to understand it if we want, I think the more we realize how far behind we actually are, how little we know. How even these like really, really simple organisms have been solving problems for millions, hundreds of millions of years. And they have come up with solutions over time that are efficient and resilient, that balance efficiency and resilience in a way that we don't. And there's a lot to be learned from that. And I think, my hope is that the more we learn about natural systems, the more humble we are. I don't think that's necessarily the way that things go, but I don't know. I can only hope that is what happens. I just think that there's a lot of different fields and disciplines that are thinking about these subjects that aren't necessarily in conversation with one another. People who are building machine learning architectures aren't necessarily talking to systems biologists or, slime mold researchers. There's not a lot of dialogue there. So perhaps those lessons aren't being internalized, but there is so much to be learned from the natural world. Both on a material level, like how, spider silk is an incredibly powerful, like material that is more tensile and strong than anything that we have built. But also, just from the architectural standpoint, like how ant colonies compute complex calculations. There's a lot to be modeled if we're just willing to make those connections.
I'm curious now to finally get into the slime molds. Let's learn about slime molds. Like how did you first discover slime molds, and how do you study them? Is it merely by literature, by biologists writing and researching slime molds, or are you kind of also, getting into the lab under the microscope?
Slime molds are relatively easy to keep. I've talked to a lot of researchers who say that you could just keep it in a dark drawer on a piece of, damp paper towel and feed it oat flakes, and you can have your very own slime mold if you want. I'm not particularly interested in keeping one as a pet, although I do think they are fascinating. I've seen them in the wild. Actually, this really funny experience where I was at a writing residency over the summer in the woods, and I was thinking and writing about slime molds every day, and then I would go on these hikes in the forest, and just like they would almost step on them. They were everywhere, they were all around me, and it's truly uncanny to spend a lot of time talking to biologists, systems biologists, and researchers about just the computational and cognitive capacities, I guess, of these very simple organisms. And then to see one in the wild and realize, like, if I didn't know that about this organism, I would just ignore it. It looks like a mushroom. It looks like a bit of mucus on the ground. I would completely discount it. But because I've read all of these studies and watched all of these, time-lapse videos of it solving mazes and making decisions and weighing its options and doing all these things that we usually associate with, multicellular organisms and not these unicellular slimes. I wouldn't know that it was capable of that. And then you kind of zoom out and you think like, well, what else don't I know? And I'm standing in the woods, I'm surrounded by hundreds of mushrooms and newts and roots and microorganisms. And they're all have their own capacities that are very specific to their environment, very specific to their own evolutionary history, but they all have their own capacities. There are hundreds of kinds of slime molds. We only really actively study Physarum polycephalum, but there's lots, and they all have different skills. So it's humbling to think that everything in nature has its own cognitive ability, that if we simply, we're curious enough or humble enough to understand and figure out how to leverage, that we could, build something really beautiful. Anyway, I came to slime molds. I mean, I'm not going to take credit for discovering slime mold. There's plenty of people that have been thinking and writing about it for
I remember
years.
When I started the podcast, I think we started a podcast also in 2021, another pandemic project. But I think in the very first episode, we also talked about slime molds.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
they're very, they're like a charismatic model organism for all sorts of discourse.
It was Shannon Mattern, a professor in New York, that I think also mentioned
amazing.
it in
Yeah,
some
I love
way.
her work.
Yeah, anyway,
I first started writing about them, probably around that same time, honestly. I wrote a piece just exploring slimes as a material substrate, as an alternative to silicon. I have a bit more of a kind of nuanced view on it now. I mean, I was very enamored by, there's this field called unconventional computing, which is a very rogue, unholy hybrid of computer science and sort of wet lab biology, where people are really taking this sort of literal understanding of these systems. So actually building an actual computer chip from a slime mold, actually building some kind of primitive logic gate from, fungal mycelium, finding ways of functionalizing living organisms to, do these really basic computational tasks. And there is something really amazing about that, injecting a slime mold with, nanoparticles that are conductive so that it can create it can draw its own network, and we can build an actual computer chip that actually conducts electricity. It's very tempting to imagine a future in which we have these, wet computer systems that are kind of functionalized living organisms. Now I think that I've talked to a lot more biologists who actually work with these organisms to understand their cognitive capacities. And I think that taking this uniquely material computational perspective on it is maybe even a bit limiting in a way, because we're essentially, it's what I was talking about earlier, we're taking the idea of the computer, the metaphor of the computer, as a framework for understanding something alive. It's sort of artificial though, right? I mean, how conductive an organism is, or what simple computational tasks it can fulfill for us, for our interests, isn't necessarily a clear reflection of its capacities inherently as a living organism. There's plenty of things a slime mold can do that are not useful to us. And so maybe it's a bit reductive in a way to think of it just as a potential computational substrate. And it's maybe more instructive to look at it, in its own environment, in its evolutionary history, and think, what can it do and what can we learn from that, rather than what can we make it do for us, I don't know. I just think that computers are this thing that we invented and we use it as a benchmark for intelligence. But like I said earlier, it's just one architecture among many. And it can be kind of limiting to think of nature only in those terms. At the same time, everything in nature computes in some way. So I think it's about sort of inverting our definition of what a computer is, stepping away from this sort of material definition and looking more at the act of processing information, of remembering things, of making decisions, of doing all these things that I think maybe we associate more with intelligence than with the mechanism of computing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I mean, I would argue that probably the interest in slime molds comes because we are right now in a stage of network computing that makes slime molds interesting to us. Whereas maybe 40 years ago, where we were at the beginning of that stage, we just simply didn't understand why it would be useful to study slime molds, and probably that history will continue. That we might in 100 years understand slime molds in a completely different way, or because we have developed new concepts. Mm-hmm. Maybe also in this sort of constant call and response with nature, that it inspires things that humans build, and then these concepts that we build inspire new ways of looking at nature. So
Totally.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think what I find interesting about the way you write about it is that I think my perception is a biologist that studies slime molds probably just talks about slime molds and research and new understandings of it. But the way you contextualize it is always from a specific human standpoint in the way we create reality using the concepts we have on hand, such as computing, and what we might be learning from nature or from slime molds. So going back to what you said at the end of answering this question, where you're like, maybe it makes more sense to study slime molds in nature itself without putting that specific lens of computing to it. That's a deeply philosophical question, if we can even do that, right? If we can be neutral. So, I mean, did you think about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, it's impossible for us to. And I wrote a piece earlier this year about the history of microscopes and sort of realizing that, like, the closer we get to the world, I mean, literally the closer we get to it, like the more we're able to peer into these like smaller and smaller realms of detail, the more we're manipulating and altering the natural world in order to make it visible to us. Like, in the olden days of optical microscopes, we were just looking through a lens at something. It was still not a clear picture because, you need light, and a lot of organisms that are alive respond to light in different ways. So their behavior is going to be different when they're under the microscope than if, they were just swimming around in a pond. The lens itself has aberrations and optical flaws. But now, we're in a realm of, like much more abstract forms of seeing. We are doing all kinds of manipulation. We're freezing and slicing and preserving and probing the living world in ways in which, like, what we see is only a slice of what's really going on. There's that. I think that's true for a lot of science. Studying living systems is even more difficult because, of course, they operate in the context of their environment. There's a myrmecologist, an ant researcher that I really love, Dr. Deborah Gordon, that I've written about a few times, who has done a lot of really interesting work on ant colonies, as much in their own contextual environment as possible. It's really difficult to study ants because there's lots of them and they move around and like you can't count them very easily. But, she's made this really like interesting point, which is that all of these different kinds of ant colonies, their behavior, the way that they are structured, like their actual like architecture, network architecture, is a response to their environment, right? Like certain kinds of ants will build different kinds of trails based on how quickly their environment around them changes, the circumstances change. They're very much in tune with their environment. So you can't take that colony and put it in a lab and assume that you can learn anything real about them because they're completely, intertwined with their natural environment. Of course, it's difficult to study plants in a laboratory because they will adapt and grow in different circumstances than they would have necessarily grown in nature. It's, of course, an ongoing philosophical questions of many generations of how we study the natural world without altering it or, reducing it in some way. I think we have to do the best we can and be humble, of course.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, I think I wrote down this quote from one of your articles that I think really put it to the point where you concluded, I think maybe it was about the ant colony. It proves in an irrefutable way that the modular, isolationist human framework of reality is an inaccurate representation of life on Earth. So
yeah,
we might
right.
not be able to change it, but at least know that it's reductionist by studying slime molds or ant colonies in that way.
Yeah. It's all messy, I think as the relationship between like the observer and the subject, it's, if quantum physics has taught us anything, we are always manipulating the world around us just by virtue of observing it. Self-knowledge goes a long way and humility goes a long way. I think it can make science sometimes feel impossible, but at the same time, we still do learn things and we just have to be able to draw, conclusions that are tempered by an awareness that the real circumstances of any living organism are going to be different than what we can draw from them in a lab. But it's complicated. I mean, I've talked to scientists who struggle with this a lot, with their role in the life of an organism. It's like being a surgeon or something. You have to kind of turn off one part of your brain in order to explore something else. You have to like compartmentalize a bit in order to manipulate life. But yeah, I don't know. It's an ongoing struggle.
I'm curious about your research process or writing process, because it sounds to me like you have this dual strategy of both reading a lot and going into archives and educating yourself and following your curiosity, but probably similar maybe to how you did it in broadband, where the approach reading broadband was really pleasant because you told a story. You told a story of like how you met these female inventors and how you traced them, and we can follow kind of like your research there. Is this a similar approach you do now, where you interview scientists and you're probably planning to write a book in a similar way? That is kind of like a journey we go together on.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't know how to write things without taking that kind of human perspective on it. I think, I have a lot of respect for more sort of traditional science writers who have that academic background, who are able to, explain really complex subjects. I do the best I can. I rely so much on the people who are willing to speak to me about their work. I love talking to scientists, and I try to talk to as many people as possible when I'm writing something, across a spectrum of thought and different disciplines to try to get at something. But I also really like to connect things as much as I can to culture, literature, to our own, embodied experiences of being people in the world. I try to think of myself as kind of, I don't know, like a guide through the darkness or something. Like I don't claim to be an expert, but I'm here to learn along with you, and I'm gonna forge ahead a bit, and like talk to people and shine the light and try to make the connections that will help people understand things in a larger context. I mean, what attracted me to science writing in the very beginning of my career was the fact that I am an artist and a writer. All my friends are artists and writers and musicians and filmmakers. They're all brilliant people, but they don't necessarily know a lot about, how the universe works. And I feel like they would benefit from that because they have beautiful minds that can, make connections and it's like we should all understand science a lot more than we do. It's just there's this constant, I think, battle. Often when I talk to scientists about their work, they're very, they can be quite reserved. I'm drawn, of course, to iconoclastic scientists who are willing to be a bit more like, holistic and willing to make extrapolations and are comfortable with their position. But a lot of scientists, just by virtue of, how those disciplines operate, they don't want to say anything more than what they can like really prove, obviously. They don't want to make big leaps. They don't want to say, well, what if, because that's not their job. They're very prescribed about what they're willing to say. So it's this constant battle between like, oh, this is really interesting work. It has enormous implications. It's philosophically fascinating. It's aesthetically really interesting, or it's making me think. It's lighting up all these light bulbs in my head. And I know that people like me will have a similar experience when they learn about this stuff. I've just got to figure out a way to like communicate that across worlds without misrepresenting anyone and without reducing anything. Because of course, I mean, the plague of contemporary science is this sort of clickbait journalism that tends to be done, especially when really big, difficult to understand advances are made in physics or biology, where it's like, for example, I've written a lot about xenobots, which are these really interesting, essentially like wet lab thought experiments of building rudimentary robots out of frog cells, which really just means taking the cells of a specific kind of frog, kind of putting them in a mold, carving them, and setting them to do certain tasks to show that the cells themselves have kind of their own inherent onboard capacities that are not necessarily related to the task of being part of a frog, that cells themselves have a kind of cognitive ability, which is really interesting work and really controversial work for some people because we get into semantics and questions of what is a robot, et cetera. But a lot of the like mainstream journalism or whatever, science news articles you see on the internet are like, living robots are coming, they're going to eat us all. It's immediately very reductive. So I think, a lot of biologists, especially people who are doing work that's potentially easily misinterpreted, are incredibly guarded about what they're willing to communicate. And I think sometimes that can be an enormous loss because, it is really interesting, but for maybe different reasons than the average clickbait reader might find. And so I think part of what I try to do is find the thing that's interesting that isn't the obvious thing. that isn't AI is coming and take over the world, intelligent robot, like the obvious stuff that we get from movies and science fiction and, just general cultural paranoia. What is like the thing that's like 3 levels deeper than that is really makes you think and really has like some interesting implications for just like, not necessarily like some science fictional future, but just your own perspective of where you exist, in relation to other things on Earth and as part of a, larger complex system that we call planet Earth.
You mentioned at the beginning you are still exploring. So, it's been now roughly 4 years that you've been, I think, researching and writing every other month, sharing your research about it. Are you still in a stage where, I don't know, you need to talk more, to research more, to know more before you are able to form? I mean, will the book even have a sort of thesis, or will it, or you don't want to put any pressure
Dude,
on you?
I'm honestly, for one, I've also been doing a lot of other things, to be completely honest with you. Like I do music. I've been working on a video game for 2 years simultaneously. We don't have to talk about that, but there's a lot of other things going on that slow my capacity. If I could devote 100% of my time to this stuff, I would. But yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to stay open to what the form of it could be. I recently, like I mentioned, went on this writing residency with the intention of banging into a first draft of this book. And I did a lot of writing, but then I also found myself like wanting to write fiction about this because I felt like there was this space of possibility I wanted to explore that I couldn't quite, as a science writer, like in good conscience, explore. You know what I mean? I'm also constantly fighting against just the expectations of, the kind of mainstream trade publishing that I would want to be in, which is like, you need to have a like simple bullet point takeaway. It has to be like, this is the true story of that. This is the untold story of that. This is what this really means. And I just like, it kind of goes against like how I like to think. And I would like to think that I would be able to continue to write about this stuff, have it cohere into a larger text and some greater singular point emerge. But I think right now, a lot of the science that I'm writing about, it's quite atomized. Like, it's not like there's one big field that is like biocomputers and everyone's working in it. There are all of these different kind of rogue researchers in all these different spaces who aren't necessarily communicating with one another, who aren't necessarily even building towards something. They're just doing, the research in their world. So, there's like the artificial life people who are really interested in building AI systems from the bottom up rather than from the top down by using, evolutionary algorithms and sort of simulating evolutionary processes in code. That's a really interesting world. That is biology and computation, but it's not the same thing as people making robots out of frog cells. Those people aren't necessarily communicating with one another. So, it's coming from all these different directions. Another thing I think is really interesting is in actual biology, like in working, experimental and field biology, there is this growing kind of willingness and openness to employing the language of computer science in talking about the study of living systems. So it used to be quite unusual, but it's now not at all that unusual to hear a biologist, talk about the information processing capacity of an ant colony or, like using these kind of computer science words. And that's because, biologists rely on computer models and simulations often to like in their research and in their work. It's like a essential complement to field work. So there's this kind of, I don't know, like, yeah, like on a pure language level, a lot of overlap that's beginning to emerge there. That's not necessarily like biologists, doing stuff in computer science. It's just they're like beginning to kind of absorb that terminology more. I think that's really interesting too. So there's all these things that are kind of, they're in this overlap in the Venn diagram. But what they point towards, I don't think we know yet. I think for me, it's just they point towards an alternative possibility of what computing can be and how we can think about computing that breaks us out of this kind of extractive, capitalistic, doomy, libertarian Silicon Valley nightmare that we currently are inhabiting. And it shows a path forward for thinking about computing in a way that's not isolationist, that actually like brings us back into conversation with the living world. I think we have this tendency to think of computers as other than, as separate from nature, as technology as being separate from nature. But if we could somehow create technology that's modeled on natural systems, that is inspired by natural systems, then maybe we can actually be in a real conversation with the living world that kind of brings us back into the fold of it. And I don't know, provides a potential off-ramp to this kind of apocalyptic vision that we're currently heading towards.
I think there's, we had last year, we had James Bridle on the podcast to talk about ways of being, and you also interviewed them, I think also last year. And I also noticed that there are some some parallels in a way, that I think one of the core theses that James arrives in Ways of Being, which I feel like is also a very open explorative book, is that this notion that sounds so simple and is yet so revolutionary in some way, that everything is connected, that we have to look at things as part of like an interconnected web of relationships. And that in itself is an interesting perspective, because we tend to isolate things. And so can you tell us more about your view on how everything is connected and how that evolved maybe? I mean, too big of a question maybe, but how your point of view on these interrelationships between everything evolved through that research you've done over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of James's work, obviously, and that book is amazing. And in some ways, I feel like, well, I don't need to write a book about this stuff because James has already done it. I think people will be studying and reading that book for generations. Yeah, I mean, it is the most obvious thing in the world, but our entire culture is oriented around forgetting it. Especially in the States, it's this profoundly, isolationist view of reality. It's every man for himself, and it's not at all rooted in the true nature of things that exist right outside of our windows. I think what I find interesting is it's not just that we're all in this together in some kind of emotional or political way of thinking about it. I think it's what happens when all of these different constituent parts, organisms in a living system, what phenomena emerge dynamically from all these interrelationships. It's a sort of the complexity science thing of, complex systems are greater than the sum of their parts, right? You can't understand an ant colony by taking every single ant and interviewing it, where were you last night? You can only understand it in the aggregate. The phenomena emerge from all of these micro interactions that can't really be explained by an analysis of the constituent parts. I think that's what's really kind of exciting about living systems, is that sort of the way that they resist traditional scientific analysis. The only way to really study them and understand them is through a much more kind of synthetic model where we're, trying to build, when we try to build simulations or models of these kinds of systems, the only way to do it is to kind of replicate this bottom up complexity and see what comes out of it. There's a sort of, you can't control necessarily. You have to just sort of watch phenomena emerge. And I think that whatever that is, that dynamic thing that defines life, that kind of emergent complexity that defines life, that's the juice, that's the thing. I don't know. I've talked about this before. That's as close as I get to religion, is just whatever that force is that emerges, that cannot really be reduced. It only emerges from the interrelations of organisms that cannot exist in a vacuum. That's why life exists. That's why life is resilient. That's why it's managed to persist over such long periods of time. That's where we came from. It's this sort of emergent multi-scalar phenomena too, because it's if you think about just a single organism, think about just a person, we are obviously just a bag of cells. Each of those cells has its own capacities. Each of our neurons has its own capacities. No single one of them is you. It's how they interrelate with one another, that from that you get you. And then the same thing is true for us, as organisms within an ecosystem, within a society. It's these sort of dynamic complexities emerging at multiple scales simultaneously. I just find that infinitely compelling. And I mean, we'll never understand it. We could never understand it, but it's humbling. And it's like, it's what drives a lot of my work is just trying to like get at that and give it a name.
Thank you, Claire. If you're interested in learning more about Claire's ongoing research, I highly recommend subscribing to her newsletter, Wild Information, on Substack. I can also recommend listening to our episodes with James Bridle and Shannon Maddern on this podcast, where we explored similar themes. This is the Culture and Technology podcast, produced by the Vienna Business Agency. The Vienna Business Agency supports new companies, projects, and products that develop Vienna's creative industries further.